The diesel engine, a mighty powerhouse for big machines on land, and crucially, at sea. Today, the world's biggest ships are powered by mammoth diesels with pistons the size of small trees that can weigh in excess of a half-ton alone. But diesels had once been a kind of underdog because they were up against the then undisputed king of ship engine technology, the steam engine. For the better part of a century, the steam engine had powered the world's largest and fastest ships. By the 1920s and 30s, it had essentially been perfected. But then along came a brilliant inventor and a handful of innovative designers keen to change the game. The result was the rise of an engine that still works to drive the biggest machines ever built by humanity. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs, and this is the story of how the diesel engine became the engine for ships at sea. Of course, as far as diesel engines are concerned, there was once a before time. The rise of the steam engine had been a revolutionary, explosive force. By the 18th century, steam engines had the ability to properly harness the expansive force created by steam, and already there were some very early theories that steam power could be used on ships. It wouldn't be long before those theories would formalize into concrete plans. In 1763, the English inventor Jonathan Hulls was granted the very first steamship patent. In his plan, he'd use a steam-powered engine to drive the paddle wheel on the back of a tugboat and use it to navigate in and out of the harbour. But unfortunately for Hulls, it appears the idea didn't really get off of paper and into a practical application or trial. But importantly, the idea was now out there, and it wasn't long before others would try the same thing. By the early 1800s, Hull's vision had become a reality, and steam-powered engines were gutsy enough to drive tugs that could haul sailing ships in and out of port. Now, this was a huge advancement for marine technology. It vastly cut down the amount of time ships had to spend sitting in their moorings waiting for the weather that would get them out to sea. Eventually, big ships got their own steam engines too, and it cannot be understated just how important steam was to the advancement in shipping for passenger and cargo service alike. There was no going back. See, before steam, ships had to rely on the weather, or the manual rowing of oars, to get around. Now, this made for very unpredictable voyage times. A ship was only as fast as the wind could take it, and the wind is extremely erratic as a source of propulsion. You just can't control when it comes and goes. Ships powered by steam no longer had to wait on the weather, so scheduling voyages became much easier and more predictable. Ships, for really the first time ever, could reliably operate year-round on a reliable schedule. Steamships were also just more powerful. They were better equipped to handle rough weather when they were out at sea. Voyages were much faster. Big ships could complete their journeys in a matter of weeks, and then days, after previously being subjected to life at sea for months on end. That, and of course, steam engines allowed ships to better navigate bodies of water where the wind was much less prevalent than the ocean, like on rivers. So steam-powered ships dominated the sea, and some of the most famous ships of all time were powered by steam, like the Lusitania and the Titanic. It reached its heyday with the development of the Parsons turbine, a brilliant bit of technology that's actually still in use today. It was capable of outputting enormous amounts of power, and it drove the world's fastest ships like the Queen Mary and the SS United States. But just as it appeared that steamships were hitting their stride and being perfected, along came the diesel engine with all of its many advantages, and shipping would once again undergo a huge transformation. Steamships were getting faster, seemingly with every launch. Ocean liners were frequently surpassing each other to earn the blue ribbon across the Atlantic. There was no apparent need for new technology on the surface. People were getting to where they needed to be on ships faster than ever, but innovation doesn't happen by just sitting around. Rudolf Diesel was a French-born Bavarian engineer who'd become obsessed with the idea of creating a combustion engine that capitalized on achieving what was known as an ideal thermodynamic cycle. It was all a drive to get the most fuel efficiency out of an engine. In 1893, Diesel published a paper called, prophetically, Theory and Construction of a Rational Heat Motor with the purpose of replacing the steam engine and the internal combustion engines known today. Catchy. Diesel was dreaming of an engine that transformed heat energy with insanely high thermal efficiency. It sounds complicated, but the truth is that this early attempt at theoretical writing was flawed and received some bad feedback from engineers at the time. So Diesel went back to the drawing board, not deterred, and instead he filed a patent for a kind of motor that did away with spark plugs. See, petrol engines need spark plugs. They create the artificial source or spark that ignites the oxygen and fuel mixture, creating the internal combustion that the engine needs to drive its pistons. But diesel's engine instead used a system that would take a small portion of fuel and compress it so much that it creates heat high enough to ignite the mixture and repeat the process. The end result was a motor that created huge power at relatively low engine revolutions. It was extremely efficient when compared with petrol engines of the time, and especially steam engines. For example, the gasoline used in petrol engines burnt up very quickly, but the diesel fuel used in this new kind of motor burned slower and just gave more grunt. By 1897, Diesel had built his first proper motor, a 4-stroke, 25 horsepower machine that was much cheaper to run than a steam engine or a petrol engine of the same size. Very quickly, Diesel became a very wealthy man, and his name was synonymous with his new engine. In 1906, the shipbuilding firm William Doxford & Sons began planning to introduce diesel internal combustion engines on their ships. With such a jump at the idea, it's no surprise that Doxford became one of the leading shipyards at building and designing what was then called a motor ship. Their plans were paused by the outbreak of World War I, but at the conclusion of the war, their work resumed on a diesel-type 4-cylinder engine. They were very pleased with the results of tests and trials and determined that the power plant was suitable for ocean-going vessels. There were a few huge benefits, but the key ones were that, first, a diesel engine burned liquid fuel. Traditionally, steamships had needed big coal bunkers and hundreds of men to operate all the boilers. Diesel ships did away with all that. You just need a handful of engineers by comparison. But the other main point, one of the things that made diesel engines so attractive as an alternative propulsion system, was that insane torque, that huge amount of power generated at low revolutions. Coupled with the fact that diesel engines, despite their impressive size, were significantly smaller than steam engine installations from the time, and designers had a machine that was ideally suited for use in their ships. But it would take some teething to get right. Another early adopter of the marine diesel engine was Burmeister & Wain, a Danish firm which had negotiated exclusive Danish manufacturing rights with diesel all the way back in 1898. Then, in 1912, the world's first large diesel-powered ship went to sea, the MS Selandia, powered by Burmeister & Wain engines. So enthusiastic were designers to show off this new technology that the typically tall funnel, so linked with ships of the time, was done away with entirely. It was a novelty that drew attention everywhere the ship went. In 1921, Doxford completed work on their first diesel-powered ship too, the Swedish merchant vessel Ingaren. The Doxford diesel was an immense success, and it was used on many future ships. Naturally, the design was perfected over time, but it created a new breed of vessel, the motor ship, and suddenly, after the First World War, they began to pop up all over the place. But it didn't always go smoothly. In 1926, Harland & Wolff had just completed the new motor vessel Asturias, an elegant luxury liner for the Royal Mail Line. They'd put their own 4-stroke diesel engines in, but they underperformed alarmingly, and the ship was only capable of a paltry 16.5 knots at a time when others, competitors on the same service, were managing 20 and more. Eventually, the ship and her sister were re-engined with steam turbines that did give them better speeds, but it would be a very rare instance indeed of a ship being re-engined for steam and not the other way around. So why the rush to develop diesel engines for ships so quickly? Well, the diesel engine, even in its early unrefined stage, gave massive efficiency bonuses. In fact, ship owners reported that the new engine was around 40% more efficient on fuel than steam. MS Vulcanus, the first diesel-powered ship from 1910, burned around 2 tons of oil, where competing steamships needed to burn 11 tons of coal. But there were other economic advantages as well. Famously, steam engines are very slow to fire up. A boiler could take an hour or more to produce steam from a cold start, even if another boiler on the ship was available. It would take even longer if the entire power plant was shut down. Operators of steamships knew this fact, so often they would leave more boilers running than were actually needed to avoid needing a full restart when it was time to get moving again. The boilers would be sitting idle, but burning through coal. Diesel engines, on the other hand, could be powered on and reach full capacity almost immediately. They could then be shut down just as quickly. Plus, the stowage space for fuel on a diesel ship is far less than that of steamships that needed coal. More spaces on board could be devoted to cargo and passengers, and less on fuel. Diesel ships ran cleaner as well. They're more environmentally friendly than coal-burning ships, not like that really mattered back in the 1910s and 1920s, but they were also generally cleaner for those on board. Coal burning left behind smoke, ash, and soot that could often rain from the sky, so shipbuilders had to build tall funnels to direct those emissions into the air well above the passengers' heads. If the funnels weren't tall enough, passengers could get covered in soot. Now, this is not as much of a concern for diesel ships, although designers still made it a good practice to make sure the funnels were tall enough to vent those noxious diesel fumes well over their passengers. Now, diesels proved a worthy upgrade for warships as well. In the Second World War, some of Germany's most impressive warships were powered by diesel engines, but the impact was especially felt in submarines. Submarines were never really a good fit for steam engines, to put it lightly, as we've explored with the disastrous British K-class submarines. Steam engines need a lot of holes cut in to allow for venting all that smoke and fumes, and holes in submarines generally aren't really a good idea. Now, as far as diesels are concerned, there were some early downsides. Diesel engines were less powerful per unit weight than steam engines of the time, and early on they were not always really the most reliable. But still, development and testing ploughed on ahead. 1924 saw the launch of the first large diesel passenger ship, the Aorangi, built by the Fairfield shipbuilding and engineering firm of Glasgow for the Union Steamship Company out of New Zealand. She was a shining example of what diesel ships could be for passenger travel, even though she was actually not originally designed to be a motor ship. She was about 580 feet, or 176 meters long, displaced around 7,500 gross registered tons. She was equipped with 4 6-cylinder diesel engines, which gave her a service speed averaging a little over 16 knots. Her maiden voyage was in January of 1925, sailing to Vancouver from Southampton via the Panama Canal. Now, along the route, it was recorded that Aorangi was gaining around 12 hours on the schedule set by her steam-powered fleetmates. Aorangi would go on to have a successful career of nearly 30 years, serving passengers all around the world, as well as being a troop ship in the Second World War. But a fun little quirk of the Aorangi's design is that even though she didn't really need them, their designers gave her 2 very tall funnels, probably because they thought passengers were just used to seeing tall funnels on ships. But as the 1920s and 30s wore on, motor ships' funnels shrank in size to effectively show off that cool new technology. Now, steam was still the speed king. It was almost impossible for diesels, even though they are very efficient and powerful, to compete with the raw power of a liner's superheated steam turbine system. The SS United States turbines, for example, developed an eye-watering 247,000 shaft horsepower. But for ships that didn't need to break the speed record, diesel engines became the done thing. The fuel savings and all the other benefits were just too good to pass up. Eventually, most new ships were being designed and built with internal combustion engines in mind, and the symbolic passing of the torch from steam to diesel happened in 1987, when one of the most famous ocean liners of all time actually switched her engines over. Queen Elizabeth II, or the QE2 as she is affectionately known, is one of the most famous ships of all time. And until the arrival of the Queen Mary II, she was the only ocean liner still actually in service. Her construction was completed in 1968, and her maiden voyage came the following year. She was originally built with traditional steam turbines, but almost 2 decades into her career, her owners, the Cunard Line, wanted to explore the idea of a power upgrade. Cunard wanted the ship to sail with improved fuel economy, to reduce the maintenance costs and really extend her service life. The company reached out to engine builders around the world to hear pitches on what could be done for the liner. They were open basically to considering all options, including just leaving the existing propulsion system in place with some modifications, but ultimately Cunard went with a diesel conversion. Of all the proposals, that retrofit would require the greatest initial cost and a huge amount of work. But projections showed it would result in the greatest operating cost savings between the new diesel engines and the other optimizations to the ship while she was in dry dock. With the plan in place, QE2 underwent her steam to diesel conversion from 1986 to 1987 at the Lloyd Werft shipyard in Bremerhaven, Germany. This $162 million refit would be one of the biggest conversion jobs amongst merchant ships at the time. Her tall, thin funnel and its casings had to be cut off, and the monumental steam plant broken up and winched out. Then in went the diesels, and like surgeons sewing up a patient's chest after surgery, a hefty new funnel was welded into place on top of it all. The conversion was ultimately a major investment in both time and money for Cunard, but they must have been ecstatic with the results. The new and improved QE2 was mechanically a nearly brand new ship. With a new maximum service speed of 33 knots, she was now the fastest and most powerful merchant ship in the world. But not only was she fast, she was incredibly efficient. Initial indications showed fuel savings of around 30% annually. It meant that QE2 would be saving at least $6.5 million in fuel per year. With a new lease on life, the QE2 would sail for 21 more years, an incredibly impressive feat when you remember highly successful ships from the past like Olympic only served for 25 or so years in total. In the end, she'd become the longest serving Cunarder of all time, and had travelled further than any other ship had before, both feats thanks to her diesel refit. Interestingly, QE2's conversion isn't actually a one-off. Other ships over the years have received similar refits. The Indian Navy frigate INS Bias was built with steam turbines for their raw power output when the ship was completed as late as the early 2000s. But now she's set to be upgraded from steam turbines to diesel. The work was actually started in 2024 and it's scheduled to be completed next year in 2026. It's estimated that the conversion will extend the career of the INS Bias by up to 10 years, and once the work's completed, the same conversion will occur on the remaining 2 ships in the class. It seems that just as soon as a new technology arrives on the market, its replacement is almost always already waiting in the wings. History has shown this fact to be just as true with shipbuilding as it is with anything else. The 19th and the 20th centuries were a hotbed for rapid technological design and development. In just a few stunningly short decades, ships of the world went from sail to steam and then to diesel. As prominent as diesel engines are in ships today, they too, at some point, will probably be replaced by something else entirely. The irony of it all is that the next logical leap forward in ship propulsion, nuclear power, is really just steam power with a never-ending source of heat. So maybe one day, if nuclear-powered ships really become a thing, then steam will win out over diesels at last. But the fact is now that ships of all shapes and sizes are powered by diesel engines. Now here's a curious footnote. The man who gave the engines his name, Rudolf Diesel, mysteriously disappeared off the back of an ocean liner in 1913. Some say it may be because of the fact he refused to sell manufacturing rights for diesel engines to the German Navy, who were desperately trying to beef up their fleets at the time, and that he might have been got rid of by the powers that be. Such was the sheer impact of his invention. But tragically, that brilliant innovator would never get to see his invention reach anywhere near its full potential. Today, big ships' diesel engines are monstrous things. The Wärtsilä Sulzer RT-196C engine, for example, is a 14-cylinder, 44-foot, that's 13.5 metre tall, 2,300-ton behemoth. It outputs over 107,000 horsepower alone. If only we could go back in time and show Rudolf Diesel what his invention would eventually become. July 1910. The SS Montrose is steaming from Antwerp, bound for Quebec. Britain has been gripped by a gruesome murder. Popular singer and former actress Corinne Crippen had disappeared, but then her dismembered body was found in the basement of her home, and her husband had fled with his young mistress. It was gory stuff, and the mild-mannered doctor had his face plastered on newspapers across the country. Captain Henry Kendall of the Canadian Pacific Line had read those papers, and as he strolled the decks of his ship and beamed at his passengers, he spotted 2 characters that immediately raised his suspicions. Gazing at them from afar, Kendall saw straight through the pitiful attempts at disguise. He knew it was really Dr. Crippen and his lover fleeing Europe. But what could he do? SS Montrose was now well on her way to Canada, and Scotland Yard's detectives were hopelessly behind. But Montrose, the humble passenger cargo ship, had recently been fitted with a very special piece of equipment, one that would change how ships communicate at sea forever. It would stop this murderer in his tracks, but it would go on to do much, much more. Guglielmo Marconi's device took the world by storm when it did away with wires and transmitted messages through the air itself. But arguably, the Marconi wireless system's greatest impact was on the ocean's waves, where it at last gave voice to ships which had relied for centuries on flags and rockets alone. It would save countless lives, and here's how it happened. The ocean is a cruel, harsh place. It's exactly the kind of place you don't want to find yourself alone. The brutal truth is that for hundreds and thousands of years, as soon as a ship and its crew left port, they were completely cut off from the outside world with no way of communicating. If disaster struck, or the ship ran into trouble, there was really no way to call for rescue. It was not uncommon for ships to depart and simply never be seen or heard from again. Ships did have some rudimentary means to communicate with each other, but only if they were in eyesight or earshot of one another. Ships' lookouts in the days of sail had been trained, often since childhood, to spot the telltale white smudge of canvas on the horizon and immediately identify what it was. Good lookouts possessed almost otherworldly abilities for determining what a distant ship might be, friend or foe, from extreme distances, simply from the general cut of the approaching vessel's sails or the way it lay in the water. Ships would exchange signals, military or company, to identify one another. Military signals during the Napoleonic Wars, for example, changed regularly to make it harder for enemies to impersonate one another. Combinations of flags or lanterns on different masts, along with gunshots at specific moments and in specific directions, could mark an approaching ship out as a friend. Signal flags are the most well-known form of non-verbal ship-to-ship communication. Each letter in the alphabet, along with the numbers 0 to 9, has its own colourful flag, combinations of which can spell out specific words, messages, or orders. Famously, at the Battle of Trafalgar, Lord Nelson signalled his fleet, "England expects that every man will do his duty." Except not every word was spelt out letter by letter. In a kind of Navy shorthand, a code devised by Lord Home Popham, each word had its own combination of signals to make it easier to message. All except, strangely maybe, for duty, which Popham had not assigned a combination, in which signalmen did have to spell out letter by letter. Flags could tell a lot about a ship. Obviously there was the national ensign, which showed ostensibly where the vessel was from, but flying the home colours upside down was an internationally recognised distress signal. At night, when flags couldn't be seen, ships could use lanterns or rockets to communicate distress or summon a harbour pilot. Even into the days of steam, merchant ships used company signals to identify each other. The White Star Line, for example, would have its ships display one green light, and fire a rocket with 2 large green starbursts, and then display a second green light when positioned off the coast of Ireland and awaiting the mail, in an intricate display that couldn't be mistaken for any other companies. Visual clues weren't limited to the ships themselves either. Shore-based telegraphs could position flags or markers in such a way as to spell out messages to each other or to ships at sea from long distances in a system known as semaphore. Channel markers and buoys were used to alert crews that they were close to land or shallow water. There were lighthouses. They could also make use of signals like bells, horns, or even cannons fired at regular intervals during foggy conditions. Ships maintained their own kinds of internal communication systems as well, and speaking trumpets were often used for inter-ship messaging. A speaking trumpet is essentially a megaphone and would amplify the voice of the user so it could be heard by the entire crew, but they could also be used to send messages to other ships provided they sailed close enough to one another. Now, while these more primitive means of communication obviously had their value, the simple fact of the matter is that they were too limited in use. If a ship was too far from another ship or the shore, none of these methods could be used at all. If there was bad weather or a dense fog, it was simply impossible to communicate. That was just the way it had always been. But then, technology began to intervene. Ships had been isolated at sea, but so too had entire continents. Nations communicated via convoluted mail lines relying entirely on dispatch riders and packet sailing ships alone. Urgent dispatches could take weeks or months to arrive. Often merchant ships were captured by vessels from nations they had no idea they were at war with in the first place. But this all changed with the introduction of the telegraph and the submarine cable. In the 1840s, the work of dozens of brilliant scientists who had worked on electrical telegraph since the 18th century culminated in Samuel Morse's device. The next decade, cables were laid which spanned oceans, and at last the continents could be linked by wire and talk to each other almost instantaneously. This didn't help ships much, but it was an exciting promise of things to come. For a device like that to work on ships, you'd need to get rid of all the wires and cables. A wireless telegraph. For the time, it must have seemed like science fiction, but the discovery of radio waves in 1887 changed the game and the young Italian inventor turned his mind towards harnessing the power of this new discovery for a very practical purpose. Guglielmo Marconi was a young aristocrat who wasn't just content to sit around on his privileged haunches. He experimented in his father's grounds through the 1890s, just trying to send messages between a transmitter and a receiver, all without wires. In 1895, he was able to transmit messages up to 2 miles without any wired connection, and just a year later he filed his patent for wireless telegraphy. He demonstrated his system to the British Post Office just a month later, and the patent was accepted the following year. The era of wireless communication had arrived. To best appreciate the magnitude of this technological breakthrough, it's worth understanding, at least in brief, how it works. The first concept in wireless telegraphy that made it such a breakthrough is that the conducting medium was not a wire, of course, but simple air. Now, this fact is why the technology would prove so crucial for ships. In wireless telegraphy's most basic form, a spark gap generator created a very large high-voltage electrical spark. Now, this spark caused rapid changes in electrical current, generating electromagnetic waves, or radio waves. Now, these waves could travel through the air. To control the transmission, the operator used a Morse key to turn the spark generator on and off, sending short dots and long dashes in signals known as Morse code. Now, the transmitter was connected to a tall antenna, which radiated the radio waves into the surrounding air directly. The antenna was crucial because it allowed the energy from the spark gap to escape into the air as electromagnetic waves. The waves spread out in all directions, carrying the encoded message with them. At the receiving end, the similar antenna captured the radio waves from the air. The receiver contained a device called a coherer, an early type of radio detector. This clever device was a glass tube filled with metal filings that changed its electrical resistance when exposed to radio waves. When the radio waves hit the receiving antenna, the signal caused the coherer to conduct electricity, allowing the receiver to detect the transmitted signal. The electrical signals from the receiver activated a recording or signaling device. For example, the signal could control a Morse sounder, which made a clicking sound for dots and dashes, or alternatively, it could even drive a pen recorder, which marked paper tape with similar dots and dashes, allowing the operator to read the message. The simplicity of this arrangement was key to its success. The more powerful the electrical generator, the more powerful the spark, and the further the transmitter range. This discovery and setup allowed for the application of Morse code to no longer be exclusive to wired telegraphs or signal lamps, but it wasn't without its quirks. For one, because the radio waves being sent physically in all directions through Earth's atmosphere, they were subject to atmospheric conditions. It meant that at night time, messages could be broadcast much further because the sun's energy would not be able to create radio wave absorbing layers like it did during the day. Then there was the fact that the messages were being sent out in all directions into the ionosphere and were detectable by anybody with their own receiving antenna. There could be no privacy. But still, a practical wireless communication device had arrived, and it brought the world closer together than ever before. As Marconi continued to fine-tune his experiments, his business grew. In 1897, he opened the first wireless factory in Chelmsford, England, employing around 50 employees, and over the next 2 years, he successfully sent wireless transmissions across the water to nearby islands. In 1901, Marconi received the first transatlantic radio signal. A station in Newfoundland, aided by a receiving antenna carried several hundred feet into the air by a kite, received a signal from Marconi's station in Cornwall, a simple 3 short dots, the Morse code for S. 2 years later, at Wellfleet in Massachusetts, Marconi sent a message from President Theodore Roosevelt to the English King Edward VII. Now, the news of this development came as a shock to the broader scientific community. Most scientists at the time thought a radio transmission could only travel in a straight line, and that it would be unable to bend with the curvature of the Earth. The signal was sent with a frequency of roughly 500 kHz and a power boost more powerful than had ever been used on a radio signal before. But aside from doing away with cumbersome cables and wired connection, it might have been difficult for all but the most forward-thinking to truly appreciate just what this development could mean for society. It would need to prove itself to be more than just a novelty. While Marconi refined his invention, soon its worth was demonstrated by a series of increasingly dramatic events. In December 1898, the British Lightship Service authorised the establishment of wireless communication between the South Foreland Lighthouse at Dover and the East Goodwin Lightship, which were 12 miles or 19 kilometres apart. It was just months before this setup was put into action. On the 17th of March 1899, the East Goodwin Lightship sent the first wireless distress signal on behalf of a merchant vessel. Elba had run aground on the Goodwin Sands. The message was received by the radio operator of the Southfold lighthouse, and with the message taken, the operator was able to summon the nearby town of Ramsgate to dispatch their lifeboat to the rescue. In the autumn of 1899, Marconi sailed to the United States at the invitation of the New York Herald's newspaper to cover the America's Cup International Yacht Race off the coast of Sandy Hook, New Jersey. Here, the first wireless demonstration in the United States occurred aboard a Puerto Rico Line steamship. Marconi left the United States for England in November 1899 aboard the American Line's SS St. Paul. It would prove to be a crucial voyage. Marconi and his assistant installed wireless equipment on the ship, and then a week later the world's first mid-Atlantic wireless message was sent. The St. Paul successfully sent a Morse-coded message to an English radio receiver some 66 miles off the British coast. The message read simply, "All well aboard, everything satisfactory." Just like that, the world of maritime communication was changed forever. Ships could speak with their own voice. Some ship owners jumped at the chance to have Marconi's equipment installed on their own vessels, but it was a slow rollout, and many ships still went to sea without a wireless radio installed. For one, Marconi would only lease the equipment to shipping lines and not sell it. Wireless operators would be employed by the Marconi company directly, not the shipping line as part of the contract. The cumbersome Marconi equipment was installed on ships by dedicated technicians who would physically mount the transmitting and receiving apparatus within a designated radio room on the ship, often located near the bridge. The truth is that many skippers and shipping lines were slow to take to the new technology. They trusted the ways of old that had been proven over the centuries of practical experience. It meant that even when it was installed, Marconi systems were treated more as a novelty, sending inane passenger messages back to shore, rather than communicating critical navigational information from ship to ship. A whole new generation of professional began to be trained, the curious creature known as the wireless man. These were often young, technically minded men straight out of school. They trained at the same schools, in the Marconi system, and they got to know each other very well. Over the airwaves, they'd cut in on each other's conversations with jokes, insults. They often spoke in their own kind of language. GTHQRL meant "go to hell, I'm busy," and GMOM, "good morning old man," was the standard greeting. But as the machine's usage began to grow, so too did its power. Reception was reaching up to 2,100 miles, or 3,400 kilometres on the most powerful shore-based sets, and a transmission from the Marconi station in Glace Bay, Nova Scotia, became the first radio message to cross the Atlantic in one go from North America. Marconi began building high-powered stations on both sides of the Atlantic to communicate with ships at sea. A transoceanic system was established where shore stations could pass messages onto ships within range, and the same message could bounce around the Atlantic from ship to ship until it found its intended recipient. With stations popping up all the time on shore and the wireless Marconi system installed on ships at last, it was only a matter of time before Marconi and his invention would be thrust dramatically into the public spotlight. In 1909, the Marconi Wireless finally proved that it was more than just a toy. The RMS Republic was White Star Line's flagship vessel for the Boston service, and she was known as the Millionaire's Ship because of the number of wealthy Americans who travelled on her. She was an early adopter of the Marconi system, and it was all for the better because in January 1909 she began to sink fully loaded with passengers and crew. The Republic was sailing from New York City to Gibraltar and the Mediterranean ports when, off the coast of Nantucket, the ship found herself enveloped in a dense fog. Suddenly, out of the mist, appeared the Lloyd Italiano liner SS Florida. She struck the Republic hard amidships on her port side, and 2 passengers who were asleep in their cabins on the Republic were killed instantly, and so were 3 crewmen aboard Florida. Immediately, the engine and the boiler rooms on Republic began to flood, and she took on a bad list. But while the crew organised the passengers on deck, the ship's wireless operator, Jack Binns, became the first in history to issue a CQD distress signal. In the immediate aftermath of the collision, the Florida came to the rescue of Republic's passengers, but joining her was the US revenue cutter Gresham, which had responded to the distress call. Survivors were distributed between the 2 rescue ships when fellow White Star liner Baltic arrived on scene because she too had responded to the CQD. Then came the steamers New York and Lusitania, In the end, a good handful of ships were able to arrive in time to rescue all of Republic's passengers who'd survived the collision. On January 24th, the day after, the Republic sank, and she was, at the time, the largest ship to ever sink. But over 1,700 people had been rescued, with the only deaths being due to the collision and not the sinking. Over 200 wireless messages were sent over the course of Republic's sinking, coordinating a massive rescue effort between multiple ships. Of course, such a rescue effort would not have been possible without the installation of the Marconi radio. It was worldwide news. The new machine had saved hundreds of lives and showed just what it was capable of. Ocean travel, it seemed, had suddenly got much safer. The Republic's loss was the first in a series of famous, high-profile ship sinkings at the first half of the 20th century that really showed off the worth of the Marconi wireless. Soon there would come Titanic, the Empress of Ireland, and Lusitania. But in the years before all those tragedies, the Marconi wireless would have one more triumphant moment when it stopped a murderer in his tracks. And so we come back to Dr. Hawley Harvey Crippen. He was a mild-mannered homeopathic physician in New York City who'd married aspiring actress Cora Turner. She was described as intimidating, and she lived an extravagant lifestyle when compared to her meek and mild-mannered husband. They'd moved to London in 1897, where she performed as a music hall singer and took on affairs with other men. Crippen, meanwhile, sold patent medicines, where he was aided in his business by Ethel Leneve, his young secretary, and soon she became Crippen's mistress. Then, in January 1910, Cora disappeared. Initially, Crippen explained that Cora went off to the United States on a visit, but suspicion grew shortly thereafter when Leneve moved into Crippen's home and was seen wearing Cora's jewellery and furs. The doctor was visited by Inspector Walter Dew of Scotland Yard, and he told the inspector that Cora had actually left him to live with another man. Dew actually bought the story, and he left, but just hours later Crippen had fled the country along with Leneve. A search of the house was ordered, and the findings were horrifying. Partial human remains were found in a hole in the basement, and forensic analysis identified the remains as those of Cora, thanks partly to the location of a distinctive scar. She had supposedly been poisoned and dismembered. In July, after months on the run, Crippen and Leneve boarded the SS Montrose as the ship steamed from Europe for Canada. Crippen's lover was dressed in bus clothes and pretending to be his son, and if the pair had travelled in steerage, or incognito, they might have got away with it, but instead, they booked saloon class. The ship's captain, Kendall, had recognised the pair on his rounds and notified his superiors via the ship's Marconi telegraph system. He sent an outgoing message which read, "Have strong suspicions that Crippen London cellar murderer and accomplice are among saloon passengers. Accomplice dressed as a boy. Voice, manner and build, undoubtedly a girl." Inspector Dew received the message and the chase was afoot. With the sluggish Montrose slowly making her way for Quebec, Dew boarded the White Star Line's Laurentic, which was much faster. He overtook the fugitives, and there, in Canada, he laid in wait for the dramatic arrest. Or at least, it should have been dramatic. Instead, posing as the pilot, Dew stepped aboard, spotted Crippen, and walked up to him simply saying, "Good morning, Dr. Crippen. Do you know me? I'm Chief Inspector Dew from Scotland Yard." Crippen was resigned. "Thank God," he said. "It's over. The suspense has been too great. I couldn't stand it any longer." Returned to London, Crippen was found guilty of his wife's murder and was sentenced to death by hanging, while Leneve was acquitted, since she was just an accessory to the murder at most. If Crippen had made it to Canada and fled to the US, he would have got away with it, but thanks to Captain Kendall's sharp eye and the power of the Marconi wireless system, he was foiled instead and sent to the gallows. In the years since, Crippen's guilt has been debated endlessly, and efforts at conclusively identifying the remains that were found in the basement have yielded conflicting results. But still, the story was an Edwardian scandal that became front-page news around the world, and Marconi's telegraph was front and centre. For hundreds and thousands of years, sailors have taken to the sea in ships. It's just really hard to believe that for the longest time, any kind of meaningful long-range communication was just a thing of fantasy. The thought of sailing out to the open ocean for weeks or months at a time, with no way to call for help, sounds like a terrifying prospect, and yet that was just everyday life for all of our ancestors. That is, until Guglielmo Marconi put his mark on history. In the years after the Crippen case, the Marconi wireless system would play a critical role in saving thousands of lives in disasters like Titanic and the Empress of Ireland, all those during the First World War and beyond. Eventually, the Marconi wireless became requisite on most ships. No longer just a novelty, big liners were required to carry enough radio operators so that somebody would always be on duty. They became part of the ship's crew, and the transmitter was almost as important to the ship as its own keel. Guglielmo Marconi passed away at the age of 63 on July 20th, 1937, and as a tribute, transmitters around the world observed 2-minute silence in his honour. It was a fitting eulogy for the man who gave a voice to ships. The mighty RMS Aquitania, for her time one of the largest ships in the world. This monstrous liner weighed close to 50,000 tonnes and was nearly as long as 3 football fields. She was a floating town with room enough for 3,200 people. Now, for 1913, these kinds of numbers were very impressive, but none of it would have been possible without a much smaller kind of craft to help out. The tugboat, small in size but hugely powerful. For decades, these vessels have guided ships in and out of harbours around the globe, working around the clock to safely tend to much larger ships. In Aquitania's day, the tug was absolutely pivotal. But then the technology was simple and fairly crude. You might need 5 or 10 or more tugs for a single ship. Today, things are much different. Tugboats can turn on a dime. They aren't just little boats with powerful engines anymore, they're insanely expensive pieces of cutting-edge technology capable of pulling off incredible manoeuvres by themselves. From docking monumental bulk carriers many times bigger than Aquitania, to towing vessels dead in the water which are dozens of times their own size. Tugboats are the hero vessels that keep the shipping world going. But there was once a time when tugboats were little more than a novelty and the idea had actually struggled to catch on. It took a few visionary inventors decades to prove that the idea had legs and tugs could change the game, and change the game they truly did. Before the Industrial Revolution transformed ships forever, sails and oars were the only way people could go any significant distance. Mighty sailing ships ruled the waves, magnificent galleons and fat, heavily laden trade ships bound for the East Indies. There was just one problem. Ships were huge, and they had no easy way of coming in and out of port. It meant that larger vessels had to remain at anchor and rely on smaller craft like cutters or gigs to ferry passengers and cargo to shore. The docking process was a complex and awkward affair, and it often just came down to good old-fashioned elbow grease. See, ships couldn't just sail right up into the docks. With momentum behind them, even if the crew reefed the sails at exactly the right moment, the vessel was likely to smash straight into the pier at speed. Instead, the headway needed to be dropped far enough away from the dock so that a safe approach could be made. But with sails furled, there was no easy way to sail into port. Instead, the crew needed to put their backs into towing their own ship. The boats would be got away, and then lines were rigged, and the men just needed to row. It was slow going and very hard work. Think of the opening scene of Les Miserables, where dozens of men are toiling away to tow and dry dock a ship. This was just everyday life for generations, and even then, it only worked for ships of around 200 tons. Anything bigger than that proved virtually impossible to manhandle into position. So they would sit at anchor for days and days while small boats zipped back and forth to resupply them. Then there came a technological breakthrough that changed everything and would one day go on to save a lot of ships' crews some backbreaking labour. In the 18th century, for the first time, boats began to be driven by steam engines. They were small and fairly awkward things, because steamships wouldn't come for some time yet. These early steamboats were little more than engineering novelties. We're now used to the idea, but back then the sight of loud boats with smokestacks pouring smoke was almost comical. They were, for the longest time, considered little more than toys for the rich or prototypes for boffins and mad inventors. For those boffins and mad inventors, though, the practical applications were pretty obvious. Enter Jonathan Hulls of Gloucestershire, England. In 1736, he had a radical idea. What if a paddle-driven steamboat could tow a sailing ship into port? It's pretty impressive stuff, given Hulls drew up his idea some 33 years before the birth of Napoleon. This was truly cutting-edge technology. Hulls was a dreamer, but sadly he didn't live to witness the realization of his idea, and it stayed on the drawing board. But then years later, in 1801, somebody finally tried to pull his idea off. The Charlotte Dundas was a small paddle steamer that used a horizontally mounted steam engine in a very simple arrangement. In 1803, on its first voyage, the ship showed its merits when it chugged ahead through a powerful breeze when every other vessel in the canal had stopped. But crucially, the feat was accomplished while the Charlotte Dundas was hauling two 70-ton canal barges behind her. Now, the concept of the towboat was proven dramatically, and it was an impressive start, but then the project's benefactor died and the idea lost momentum. Frustratingly, the concept of the functional, load-towing boat was again shelved, and the valiant little vessel was eventually broken up. Now, while the Napoleonic Wars raged on, some other dreamers and doers began to scheme. One was Richard Trevithick, a British engineer and a real pioneer in the early days of steam power. He had a vision in mind of a dedicated boat designed to attend other larger ships. Powered by steam, it would go a long way to helping ships in and out of port. He called his idea the nautical labourer. He had bigger and grander ideas for the boat too. If it could carry steam pumps and machinery, she could fight fires or load heavy cargoes. It was a great idea, but it stalled on the drawing board and never took off. On that one, Trevithick was truly too far ahead of his time. It seemed that steamboats were little more than newfangled gadgets with very little practical purpose, but then in 1814 something interesting happened. On the Tyne River at Newcastle, England, an early steamboat, creatively named the Tyne Steamboat, was built to act as a kind of passenger vessel, but the venture failed after 2 years of poor ticket sales, and the boat was put on the market. Now fortunately, it was bought by a clever entrepreneur named Joseph Price, who had a totally different purpose in mind for the old Tyne Steamboat. First, he thankfully diced the old name and renamed his boat Perseverance. Then, in the summer of 1818, he pulled off an experiment. He later wrote, "At the time appointed, I requested him to throw a line on board the steamer. The tide was against us the first 3 miles. Everything answered as well as I could wish. The vessel was towed 2 miles over the bar in 2 hours and 10 minutes, a distance of 13 miles, the wind against us all the way. This was the first time a sailing vessel was ever towed by a steamboat." Now this was the kind of breakthrough moment the towing vessel had needed all along. It was so successful that Price put another old passenger steamer into service, converted just to tow other vessels on the Tyne, and within 3 years there were 14 other boats like this operating in the river. Slowly the idea began to catch on across Britain. In London, an early steamer, the Majestic, was tasked with towing an East Indiaman sailing ship into Woolwich from Deptford. It was only about 5 miles, or a little over 8 kilometres, but there, in front of the curious and watchful eyes of London's citizens, Majestic thundered down the Thames and did the job with ease. Then, another steamship did the same thing in Liverpool. Clearly, this technology had huge ramifications, but this new class of towing boat didn't yet have a name. It was about to get one though. In 1817, a Scottish yard in Dumbarton built the first steamship designed specifically to tow other ships. Like the others, she too was driven by a powerful steam engine and a paddle wheel. She was simply named Tug. Well, clearly the idea and the name caught on because pretty soon tugboats began to pop up in all the major British and European ports. In fact, there were so many tugboats that their chugging engines and thick black smoke became a source of criticism for many, with one going so far as to tell Price his invention had ruined the port. Noise and smoke aside, the new boat, now collectively known as the tugboat, had absolutely changed the game. First and foremost, it meant that for the first time, ships as large as 400 tons could dock where previously they couldn't hope to make it. In the past, sailing ships that large had to simply moor and ride at anchor while supplies were ferried to and fro in small boats. Now they could simply be towed by steam tugs up the river and into the docks, where they could be loaded and unloaded with relative ease in just a fraction of the time. Not only that, but previously, sailing ship captains had often been incredibly frustrated by poor conditions in port when the wind might drop off for days on end. It meant they were often stuck there until a breeze could come up at just the right direction and strength to carry their ship out of port. But now, with the advent of the tugboat, they could simply be towed out of the harbour into more open waters where breezes would be stronger. It meant the ships could spend less time in port and complete more profitable voyages. In fact, the number of annual round-the-world voyages a ship could reliably do actually went up by about 60%, which was an incredible jump. Early on, in those early days, the towing business was cutthroat. In the Tyne, Joseph Price had pioneered the idea with Perseverance, But then dozens of competitors sprang up. It resulted in bizarre scenes as competing tugboat captains would race against one another at full speed to an incoming ship just to try to win the towing contract. When towing jobs weren't available, captains would pull off simple small cargo hauls or even ferry passengers where they needed to go, operating somewhere between a U-Haul and an Uber. As the 1830s and 1840s rolled in, ships began to increase in size, and then they began to be made out of iron. This was a huge jump in technological innovation because it meant ships could be made bigger and stronger, but they would need more tugs, and even then the tugs needed to be bigger and stronger too. Tugs had until then always been made out of wood, and that had to change. In 1841, the first iron-hulled tug, Defiance, was introduced and brought many distinct advantages. First and foremost, it was significantly stronger than its wooden forebears, but was surprisingly a little bit lighter. In time, paddles began to be replaced with propellers, but paddle-wheeled steam tugs still stayed in service well into the 20th century. In fact, one of the last to be built was completed in 1914. The reason for their longevity was because of the paddles. If you ran one in reverse and the other one ahead, the boat could essentially turn on the spot, something propeller-driven vessels just couldn't do. Today, tugboats are almost unrecognisable from their earliest days. They feature powerful thrusters which can swivel through all 360 degrees. They boast immense power-to-weight ratios. In fact, most huge ships coming into and out of ports only need 3 or so of these types of craft to help them. It's an amazing story of success for a vessel that, for about 81 years, from 1736 until 1817, was seen as little more than a toy. Price had introduced the world's first tugboat on the River Tyne. It's fitting that one of the 2 surviving British paddle-wheel tugboats left was built on the Tyne as well. Eppleton Hall was one of the last of her kind, introduced in 1914. After a long career, she was laid up and sold to the scrappers in the 1960s, but fortunately, renowned maritime figure Carl Corton, founder of the San Francisco Maritime Museum, stepped in to save it. She was rebuilt and made the remarkable voyage across the mighty Atlantic Ocean under her own power. Today, Eppleton Hall is moored in San Francisco, one of the last of her kind, a relic from a bygone era, and a reminder that there was once a time when the idea of towing ships with a steamboat was radical in and of itself. Picture this: there are thousands of people living in close proximity to one another. They all have various jobs and responsibilities. Some start their day at sunrise while others work the graveyard shift. Many of them are close friends and companions. There's a library, there's a movie theatre, places to shop, a laundromat, and a hospital. No, this isn't the average small town that you can find in all corners of the globe. In fact, this place doesn't even have a permanent location. This is life on the average modern-day aircraft carrier, a floating city. These massive vessels fly under the flags of the United States, the UK, China, Japan, and France, amongst others, representing the strength and brawn of their navies. Today, they're almost synonymous with the very thought of what a warship is. They've been featured in some of the most popular movies of all time, and they're the backbone of some of the world's most powerful navies. But it wasn't always that way. The fact is that the journey the aircraft carrier took from being a mere thought experiment to a bona fide capital ship took decades to become a reality. Along the way, they went through complex design evolutions, and by the time they resembled the ships of today, they'd completely changed war forever. We've always been fascinated by the skies as a species, and centuries ago, inventors were experimenting with putting things up there from ships. The earliest recorded instance of using a ship for airborne operations occurred at the dawn of the 19th century. In 1806, Lord Cochrane of the Royal Navy launched kites from his ship, the frigate HMS Pallas. Attached to the kites were brochures speaking out against Napoleon Bonaparte. The kite strings were set on fire, and when they burnt through, the leaflets descended down from the sky and landed on French soil. 4 decades later, in 1849, the Austrian Navy warship SMS Volcano was being used for launching balloons. Now, this was a lot more insidious. The intent was to launch hot air balloons equipped with a 24 to 30 pound, 13 kilogram bomb with a timed fuse, and then have them drop down on the city of Venice. At least one bomb did actually drop over its intended target, but thanks to the changing winds after launch, most balloons missed, and some actually even drifted back over the Austrian border. The American Civil War had its fair share of ship-based aerial operations too. Here, gas-filled balloons launched by Union ships were used to perform reconnaissance on Confederate positions. The Union actually maintained a balloon corps and was launching balloons from land, but once the fighting turned to inland Virginia, the forestry grew too thick for the balloons to reach their intended destinations. Instead, the Union retrofitted a coal barge to carry gas generators and balloon apparatuses, and from the ship balloons were able to be launched to fly over the Potomac River. This was claimed to be a successful mission, and the idea caught on. Even as recently as the Second World War, various navies were still launching balloons from ships to serve as aerial observation posts. In the early 1900s, the technological landscape was changed forever by the development of one of mankind's greatest inventions, the flying machine. Now, obviously, it would only be natural that launches from ships would follow suit, but it wouldn't be a quick and easy process. Way back in 1910, the French vessel Foudre was the first seaplane carrier. Now, a seaplane carrier doesn't perform the same functions as an aircraft carrier, but it's easy to see their shared lineage. Seaplane carriers instead stored seaplanes under hangars on the main deck, from which they could be lowered into the sea with a crane. Seaplane carriers also allowed for the planes to be stored, transported, and have maintenance performed on the move at sea. In the early 20th century, the development of aircraft encouraged the world's navies to begin taking interest in their potential for use as scouts for their big gun warships. See, for centuries, the massive battleship had dominated the waves as the main, powerful naval asset. At first, there'd been big wooden warships, culminating in the monstrous 3-deck ships of the line like HMS Victory in the 1800s. But by the time the airplane had become popularized, they were now enormous steel dreadnoughts. Now, their might and firepower was impressive, but even then for the time, some visionaries had some incredible foresight. In 1909, French inventor and engineer Clement Ader said, "An airplane carrying vessel is indispensable. These vessels will be constructed on a plan very different from what is currently used. First of all, the deck will be cleared of all obstacles. It will be flat, as wide as possible without jeopardizing the nautical lines of the hull, and it will look like a landing field." Monsieur Ader could not have been more in tune with what the future of naval warfare would look like, and in just 20 years, he'd be proven strikingly correct. To launch airplanes from their ships, designers started to attach structures to pre-existing vessels where planes could take off from, and then even land on in some early experiments. Now, of course, the First World War proved to be a fundamental proving ground for naval aviation on all sides. In particular, both British and American shore-based seaplane units were tasked with flying anti-submarine patrols. The US Navy also experimented with launching wheeled aircraft off of wooden platforms attached to battleships. In 1915, the USS North Carolina fielded the first at-sea aircraft catapult. It was clear, though, that these ideas were only in their infancy. Yes, planes were launching from ships, but they had no way of returning. Upon completion of a mission, pilots would attempt to land ashore, or if they weren't able to, they ditched their plane in the sea and just hoped to be fished out of the water. Although the concept was still being perfected, naval aviation was beginning to prove its worth. One notable example of the signs of the times was the HMS Furious. She had been designed as a conventional, heavily armed, Courageous class warship, but was then converted mid-construction instead into a kind of hybrid aircraft-carrying battlecruiser. In July of 1918, 7 Sopwith Camels launched from Furious and destroyed 2 Zeppelins at the Tondern airship base in Denmark. Now, the Germans had been using this base to conduct nighttime bombing raids over Britain, but the bombing of Tondern caught the Germans completely by surprise because they thought the base was way too far out of reach of British aircraft. But despite the success of the raid, the shortcomings of early aircraft-carrying ships were proven by the fact that not one of the 7 Camels made it back to Furious. World War I had convinced Navy officials that airplanes were obviously essential on the modern battlefield, but very few believed they served much more purpose beyond just observing the fall of shot for their big battleships. But tests conducted in the 1920s by visionaries like Brigadier General Billy Mitchell hinted that the era of the aircraft carrier was clearly on the horizon. Officially, the first aircraft carrier ever was the British HMS Argus of 1918. The British government had purchased the not yet completed Italian ocean liner Conte Rosso, whose construction had been halted thanks to the outbreak of the war. The vessel was converted to be the first true aircraft carrier with an unobstructed flight deck, just as Clement Ader had predicted way back in 1909. Finally, aircraft could take off and land from the same ship. Argus was like a floating airfield in the middle of the ocean, and war would never be the same again. The First World War had ended before the Argus could ever be put into action, but her design had inspired the United States and Japanese navies to quickly follow suit with carriers of their own. While the Argus is the ship credited as the first aircraft carrier, Japan's Hosho was the first carrier designed as such from the keel up when she entered service in December 1922. The United States wasn't far behind with the commission of USS Langley the same year. It was essentially an experiment to see if aircraft could operate effectively off of ships, and Langley showed it was indeed possible. She served as a training ship for the US Navy's first generation of daring carrier aviators. The progression towards the world's most powerful flat-top warships was well underway, but even then, very, very few understood the true power and potential of these warships because they'd never been tested in combat, but that was going to change very, very soon. Proponents of the aircraft carrier managed to push against internal resistance to have examples built all over the world in the 1920s. The world saw the debut of the HMS Hermes from the UK, the Béarn from France, and the Lexington-class aircraft carriers from the United States in 1927. Originally, most of this early generation of aircraft carriers were actually conversions of ships that had been laid down instead as cargo ships, cruisers, battle cruisers, or even battleships. This allowed for navies to incorporate carriers into their fleets quicker, but it also shows just how little real thought was being given to the aircraft carrier as a weapon. As the 1920s wore on, this slowly began to change. While converting ships was relatively quick and easy, ordering carriers purpose-built allowed the design to be specialized for their future role and resulted in far superior ships. Finally, in 1939, the true dawn of the aircraft carrier began. It was during World War II that aircraft carriers were used on a large scale for the first time and proved themselves not just as a novelty, but as the absolute backbone of the modern Navy. They had just missed serving their purpose for World War I, but now they were ready. In a shocking twist, the world's most powerful battleships began to be hunted down and sunk by swarms of aircraft launched from carriers. The intense demand for carrier fleets led to further improvements in their design and the recovery process for their aircraft. In the end, thanks to the rapid progress of war, several itineraries of carriers were designed and put into service. The US constructed small, slow escort carriers to provide air support for convoys and amphibious invasions. Later, they developed light aircraft carriers like the USS Independence, which were faster than the escort concept and intended to keep up to speed with the fleet. Many of these ships were fast because they were originally converted from cruisers that were actually already under construction. In fact, before war had broken out, US President Franklin Delano Roosevelt had observed a lack of new aircraft carriers scheduled to join the fleet before 1944. He was the one who'd suggested converting the existing Cleveland-class cruisers' hulls. This bit of foresight helped swing the war in the Pacific in the US's favor because they could quickly get carriers out into action at a rate significantly faster than their Japanese adversaries could. Away from the Pacific, carriers saw heavy action too in the Atlantic. Where the Atlantic convoys needed protection from German submarines, the British developed what they called the merchant carrier. These were merchant ships equipped with a flat deck for up to 6 aircraft. They served as a stopgap until dedicated carriers could be constructed on a wider basis. These typically carried around 20 to 30 aircraft total, and were used primarily for anti-submarine operations. Given the ferocity of U-boat attacks from the Germans at the time, this was a critical assignment. Any tool to win the war at the Atlantic was welcome indeed. Of course, the UK used escort carriers as well. They were built on commercial freighter hulls, which made their construction quicker and cheaper. They were slow to keep up with the main forces of fleet carriers, battleships and cruisers, but they did a good job escorting sluggish merchant convoys, defending them from enemy submarines and aircraft. On the downside though, these ships were only lightly protected, and several were sunk with a great loss of life. It became obvious during the Second World War that aircraft carriers were playing a crucial role. At one point, the Royal Navy had several aircraft carriers in their fleet, while the Germans and the Italians had none. The capabilities of aircraft carriers could not have been more adequately demonstrated. In 1940, the ancient-looking Fairey Swordfish torpedo bombers attacked and damaged the Italian fleet at Taranto for only 2 losses, while the next year they badly damaged the German battleship Bismarck so she could be hunted down and destroyed. Both raids had been launched by British carriers. In December the same year, the US Navy base at Pearl Harbor was decimated by a carrier-based Japanese attack. The advantages to using carriers were clear. To Navy planners' shock, they were making the world's most powerful battleships completely obsolete. Few would argue over the power of the image of the battleship. They serve as a floating platform and advertising billboard for the strength of their home nation. Their time as the premier member of the fleet, though, was not long to be had. The tremendous battleship losses during the war changed the way navies even thought about their fleet's compositions. Here's an example. There's no argument that during the Second World War, the United States possessed some of the world's most powerful and sophisticated battleships. These culminated in the Iowa class. They served their countries on and off from the 1940s all the way up until the early 1990s, when the last battleship was finally decommissioned. But at one point, the US Navy was designing an even larger, more powerful, and more sophisticated battleship to replace the Iowas, and these would have been called the Montana class. They would have featured massive 16-inch guns and enhanced protection, designed to go up against Japan's Yamato-class super battleships, the largest ever built. In July of 1940, 5 ships in the Montana class were approved for construction, with work to begin later that year. Ultimately, the writing was on the wall for the Montana class, because by 1943 it was clear to everyone that the aircraft carrier had supplanted the battleship as the premier weapon in the Navy's arsenal. The concept was cancelled, and in a bit of tragic irony, the arrangement of the propulsion system found in the Montana class was modified instead to be used in the Midway-class aircraft carriers instead. The lesson was learnt time and time again at sea in momentous battles like Midway, the Philippine Sea, and the Leyte Gulf, where instead of Japan and America's battleships slogging it out like prize fighters, it was just the aircraft carriers and their squadrons going toe-to-toe. A squadron of dive bombers could menace big ships and destroy them with relative ease. On top of that, battleships were big and heavy. They required a significant amount of fuel and maintenance, which made them particularly costly. It's not as if battleships no longer served a purpose. They could still bombard shores to prep the battlefield for amphibious landings. They did this job very well at D-Day, Okinawa, Iwo Jima, and more. This was an important role, but ultimately wasn't enough reason to justify keeping them. The ever-decreasing role of the battleship was not just unique to the United States Navy by the end of World War II. Perhaps nothing demonstrated this better than when aircraft launched from US carriers sank the largest battleships ever built, the Japanese warships Musashi in 1944 and Yamato in 1945. Yamato had had her anti-air defense strengthened enormously in the war. She'd started out with just 24 anti-aircraft guns and ended with 150, but in the end, it was all for naught. She was completely wrecked from above in just 2 hours. The era of the battleship was over, and even then the aircraft carrier went from strength to strength. After the war, the jet age allowed smaller and less expensive ships to provide maximum firepower and destructive capability. Then the development of guided bombs made it even easier for aircraft to sink warships. Planes launched from carriers could even bombard shore establishments more effectively than big battleships ever could. Crucially, this isn't just a story of successful ship design, because as the aircraft carrier developed, so too did the aircraft actually deployed on them. Now, if not for this, and the more powerful aircraft through history, then the aircraft carrier would have remained little more than a novelty. One massive advantage was the range. With the development of external fuel storage like drop tanks, aircraft could deliver an attack from 200 miles, 320 kilometers away, or more. Meanwhile, once upon a time, a battleship would need to get within just 20 miles or less to carry out the very same attack. Originally, the biggest reason people were skeptical of airborne attacks was the uncertainty that aircraft could lift enough destructive weapons to supersede the battleship. Originally in the 1930s, this was a pretty valid concern. By the end of the decade, though, it was no longer the case. In 1918, the Tondern Raid Force had flown Sopwith Camels capable of carrying just 2 50-pound, 22-kilogram bombs. By the end of World War II, though, British carrier bombers like the Fairey Firefly could mount twin 1,000-pound, 450-kilogram bombs, or 8 rockets. Aircraft were carrying adequate payloads, dive bomber and torpedo plane designs had matured, and carrier arrestor gear and flight deck handling facilities were more than up to the task. Aircraft carriers had proved themselves as one of the most effective weapons against the ever-threatening German U-boats. They could launch airplanes to find and sink Kriegsmarine submarines and became the scourge of the German Navy. The carrier-centric fleet was most famously proven in the Pacific, but it was also crucial in turning the tide in the Battle of the Atlantic and the ultimate Allied victory in World War II. The evolution of technology is a natural and inevitable force. All things will eventually be replaced by something more powerful, more efficient, and stronger than the thing that had come before it. From their humble beginnings as novelties to becoming the flagship of world navies, aircraft carriers have truly encapsulated this idea. So revolutionary were they, in fact, that today carriers still patrol the world's oceans like knights in a game of political chess. Massive steel sentinels on the sea ready to enforce their home nation's will. There's little more intimidating than a modern-day aircraft carrier and the destruction they can bring. We can only hope we won't really be needing it anytime soon. Ladies and gentlemen, it's your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a comment below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel because we get new videos out weekly. If you want to support my work and get really cool perks like behind the scenes and early access, please visit my Patreon in the link in the description below, or sign up as a YouTube member. Come and join the crew. As always, stay safe, stay happy, and I'll see you again next time.